Most people have only been introduced to one or two theories about light, space, and time. But even as Einstein said, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when those initial problems were encountered. I want to encourage people not to get too defensive when discussing alternatives or new perspectives. Psychologically, people tend to defend the first model they encounter or are brought up with, even if that model isn't as accurate as it could be. So, rather than looking at things from the perspectives of Einstein, Lorentz, de Sitter, or Ritz, I wanted to talk about a few differences between relativity and classic physics, and a different model of light based from the work of Christian Huygens and retired NASA physicist Dr. Edward Dowdy. In order to grasp the significance and importance of Dowdy's work, we have to have some background and context to what we are comparing to. Before relativity, electromagnetism and gravity was understood under 3D Euclidean space geometry. There was no curved space, no distortions, and using only Galilean transformations and actual observations. There was space, and then there was time. They were not linked and were treated separately. The more complex technology evolved, the higher speeds achieved required more detailed explanations. Before Einstein, there were a number of ether theorists like Nikola Tesla, Steinmetz, Larmor, and Lorentz, who attempted to introduce a luminiferous ether to explain not only the constant of light, but the constancy of light. Two different things. But then came along Henri Poincaré and Minkowski, who started to interject fourth dimensions and space distortions and unsubstantiated assumptions. We will be dealing with no ad hoc assumptions, no requirement of any media for light to propagate, no need for any ether or space distortions, no 4D, just dealing with 3D Euclidean space. Wanted to say one quick thing about ether. Now, I used to believe in ether, but now I think if you can define it, then it isn't ether. I think ether is like the word quantum or magic, an esoteric and convenient cop-out to avoid talking about particle physics and dynamics on scales smaller than what Max Planck's models would allow. Anything not understood is automatically labeled quantum or magic or ether. I think there are fine and ultrafine particles of matter, like what Georges Lesage speculated. I think there are gases that pervade space that are not recognized, like what Walter Russell presented on his periodic chart from 1926, showing 24 elements before hydrogen. Thousands of years ago, ancient Greeks thought plasma was ether. But as scientific understanding grew and tools evolved, our terminology advanced and understanding also grew. So what used to be ether evolves into a now definable and definitive variable. Ether is undefinable. It's debatable that even Nikola Tesla and Charles Steinmetz viewed an electrostatic potential as being the ether. So if there are particles not recognized, and gases not recognized, and semantics about electrostatic influence over great distances, then those are real factors that we can talk about. Therefore, the more that we learn, the less ether plays any role at all. Sound, light, electricity, and most likely gravity are all spherical propagations, like a spherically expanding shock wave, outward in all directions from a point source. Within that spherical boundary are concentric shells, like Russian nesting dolls. The distance between each concentric nested sphere is equal to a wavelength of light. Light is defined as the visible spectrum range for humans, which would be shock waves of nested concentric spheres that are coherently spaced between a certain nanometer wavelength. As those spheres expand through you, past you, or around you, you experience those nested shock waves as a wavelength of light at the rate of c, or at the rate of about 720 miles an hour at sea level for sound. Although sound requires a medium to travel, electromagnetic radiation and light does not require any medium to propagate. But if there is a media present, it will be affected and present the already existing packet. There is media throughout the cosmos in any case, but it's not required for this emissions theory. And in this theory, there is no particle-wave duality, since all emissions are spherical propagations. If you were to take a cross-section of those nested spheres and trace a path on one plane from the point source, you would see that wave on the x and y axis, but it's not a wave. That's just a cross-section of the nested expanding spheres. Like dropping a pebble in a pond and seeing the ripples expand. That's a 2D representation of a 3D sphere. You're only seeing a cross-section. But that wave is in regards to a 2D graphical representation of a rectilinear path from the source of an actual 3D expanding sphere. Now, the next natural question is, what is expanding? What is waving? And again, there is no thing expanding. As an analogy, a shock wave isn't made of anything. It's a disturbance of and in a media. But so people can start to visualize Huygens' principle and how light expands, this is a great next step. Rather than thinking of squiggly lines that travel through the air, a wave is what something does, not what something is. But light is a massless disturbance. It is not made of anything. You can pick anywhere on that spherical boundary and call it a photon. You can look at the center of that expanding sphere as a photon. You can call anywhere within that spherical boundary photons. If people have a problem with that term, use wave packet. When you flick a lighter, a sphere of light propagates outward in all directions, analogous to a shock wave. So call it what you want. Here is where we begin to see subtle differences between models, which lead to major implications. Any time the straight-lined path of light is disturbed or interfered with, that portion of the expanding sphere is absorbed by the media, or the atoms making up matter, whatever interfered with it. That portion of the sphere ceases to exist, gets absorbed by the interference itself. The energy from that primary wave packet diminishes to zero and is extinguished. The so-called reflection of that shock wave is a brand new secondary wave packet altogether, being re-emitted from the surface of the wall or whatever absorbed that primary. Not that the primary wave ricocheted. This is one of the main points with the greatest implications for illusions throughout the rest of science. If the velocity of light is even a tiny bit dependent upon the velocity of the light source, then my entire theory of relativity and gravitation is false. That is a quotation of Albert Einstein from a letter to Irwin Finley of August of 1913. When we look at a mirror, that is not the same light bouncing back. Light does not ricochet. In reality, a wave packet is absorbed by the atoms making up the surface of a mirror, a wall, matter, cosmic dust, a plasma atmosphere, anything, any media of any kind. The wave packet ceases to exist, and a brand new secondary wave packet is simultaneously re-emitted at a tangent from the interference itself, giving the illusion that the original wave packet ricocheted and continued on. Now, inelastic and elastic collisions of particles apply to ricochets. Snell's law, Fermat's law, and the math to describe the tangential re-emissions are valid and apply. But wavefronts and shock waves are absorbed, cease to exist, and whatever interfered with them becomes a secondary emitter, reproducing a brand new wave packet. And that secondary wave is traveling relative with the secondary emitter or the interference. Which means, technically, reflection does not exist, and neither does refraction, diffraction, deflection, length contraction, dilation, dispersion, Doppler shift, or redshift, because all of those examples assume that a primary wave packet ricochets off of the surface or is interfered with and then continues on. But wave packets propagate until they are interfered with, and then they cease to exist at the point of interference, and the surface of the mirror re-emits a brand new light as an equal and opposite reaction. So, relativity and most all previous emissions theories subscribe to the idea that the same light has always existed since some Big Bang, and that the same light is bouncing around forever, ricocheting, deflecting, contracting, and then continuing on, and that light and time follow the same rules and that they're linked, but light and time are not linked. And this is the reason why relativity and all previous emissions theories and current models say that the speed of light or that the velocity of light is the same from all frames of reference. This is absolutely not the case. But it certainly seems the case because of illusions of re-emissions. The light emitted from a flashlight will always travel at the rate of c relative to the flashlight or the source. But the light emitted from a flashlight being held in your hand is not traveling the same speed as the light emitted from a flashlight moving towards or away from you at a different speed. So here are a couple examples. Re-emissions always propagate at the rate of c relative to the interference that absorbed the primary light, serving the illusion that the velocity of light is c from all frames of reference. But it is physically impossible to measure the velocity of any primary source. So by the time any sensor or detector or an observer sees the light, it is a re-emitted secondary or tertiary packet. It's a brand new light altogether. So that sphere is expanding from the flashlight at the rate of c. But if the flashlight is moving towards you at 100 miles a second, then that sphere of light is moving towards you at c plus 100 miles a second. If the flashlight is moving away from you at 100 miles a second, then that sphere is expanding from that flashlight at c minus 100 miles a second. But you will only observe the re-emission by the time it reaches your eye, or it goes into your eye. When Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity in 1915, he proposed 3 critical tests, insisting in a letter to the Times of London that if any one of these 3 proved to be wrong, or that if there were any alternative methods to yield the same conclusions and predictions, that relativity would not be needed and would eventually collapse. Here are 3 such credible challenges and alternatives which yield the same conclusions. And here is a more detailed list of other solutions and predictions concluded using Galilean transformations and pure classic physics from Dr. Edward Dowdy's extinction shift principle. Relativity subscribes to the idea that mass fluctuates, meaning mass increases as it gains velocity. But classic physics says it's an illusion of a charged mass traveling at a given rate, but within a surrounding and increasing electrostatic potential. The accelerating surrounding potential is mistaken as the mass fluctuating. The equation presented here yields the equivalent of relativistic mass. Relativity subscribes to the idea of Lorentz transformations with relativistic corrections. But classic physics uses Galilean transformations with no need for corrections. Relativity subscribes to the idea of space curvature, distortions, and fourth dimensions. Classic physics subscribes to 3D Euclidean space, the rules of Pythagoras, with 3 orthogonal axes, X, Y, and Z. Relativity subscribes to space-time being directly connected. Classic physics says there is space, and then there is time. They are not linked. Relativity subscribes to the idea that the definition of gravity is the curvature of space-time. Einstein said gravity is not a force, that there is no attraction or gravitational pull in relativity. Like a bowling ball on a mattress, the curve in the mattress does not exert any work or any force on anything on or around the mattress. Classic physics suggests that gravity is a force, and this particular emissions theory says that gravity is a spherical propagation, analogous to massless gravitons which propagate like light, and that there is an aberration effect, or a re-emission of gravity, due to surrounding media and relationship of Earth's constant motion relative to the Sun, and being offset by 20.5 arcseconds. Relativity subscribes to the idea that gravity bends light, and according to the inverse square, away from a body. Classic physics shows that light only bends in space directly at the thin solar limb, or plasma limb of a star, due to refraction, or rather a re-emission as we learned. But not even Eddington could explain why light does not bend in the corona or in the vacuum of space, disproving space curvature, while proving refraction of light from a gravitational potential gradient within a plasma atmosphere, and again only at the solar limb, at 1 solar radii. The rectilinear path of light follows a least time path according to Fermat's principle, like a straw bending in water from a different refractive index. You don't use gravitational lensing to describe why a straw bends at the meniscus or the surface of water. That would just be silly. Just like you don't use gravity to describe why light deflects only at the solar limb of a star, and why background stars appear to shift their position during a solar eclipse, but again only at the solar limb and with no distortion, only changing the position. Just want to focus on this image for one moment. On the left is what relativity and Eddington say we should see, but on the right is what both Eddington and his second team in Brazil actually observed on May 29, 1919. Refraction only at the solar limb, validated by every satellite and observatory around the world since. So they have all of these equations to describe how gravity bends light, but only one of them is correct. The equation describing light bending only at the solar limb. But again, that bending is because of refraction and not gravity. So they have slightly different equations to describe light bending farther and farther away from the sun, and they attribute all of their equations to gravity. A different equation at each distance away from a star to describe how they think light should bend at a given distance away. But none of them are real. They describe something that doesn't exist in reality, nor something that has ever been observed in the history of science or astrophysics. It's invented mathematics that only exist on paper. Only the equation describing bending of light directly at the solar limb applies in reality. But they create all of these simulations based on the other equations, and faulty equations will give you faulty simulations. But this is how some people do science now. They create math, and then they create a computer-generated simulation. Then they'll say their theory is validated because it worked out in their simulation. Then they take pictures and screenshots from their simulation and post it on the news saying they took it for real through telescopes. But some of it is just all assumptions. And so what they see is one thing, and what they claim is completely different. Why the disconnect? Okay, so relativity subscribes to the idea that the velocity of light is the same from all frames of reference, and that time dilates. But classic physics says it's the opposite. Time is the same from all frames of reference, while the velocity of light shifts dependent upon the speed of the primary source. Here is an alternative to the invariance of the wave, where time is the same from all frames of reference rather than the speed of light. Which means when we look at distant galaxies, none of that light is the original light from that source. That light is re-emitted many times before an observer in our galaxy can detect it, which means we might not be looking into the distant past. Wrap your head around that one. If the idea is to simplify our understanding using Occam's razor, then I'm confident that if Einstein were alive today, he would dismantle his own theories based upon the tools and data collected in the 21st century, and would form a new hypothesis, and then develop a new theory to explain that hypothetical scenario based on the new information. And he would also shame those who put him on an infallible pedestal. Relativity did its job for 100 years as patchwork for classic physics, until a proper emissions theory could be developed to account for the same predictions and same observations, but in a more elegant and simple fashion. There are more different ways to interpret the same information. Look at a mirror and see it's reflecting the same light or re-emitting a brand new light. Look at a streak of light in the sky and think it's Santa Claus, a UFO, or a meteor. Look at a ring of light at M87 and think it's a black hole, or a plasmoid, or a giant galaxy-sized smoke ring. Can look at the rotation of a galaxy and think dark matter is the cause, or electric and magnetic factors like a homopolar motor, Lorentz force, or Fleming rule. So when people encounter someone who challenges relativity, they automatically think flat Earth, Dunning-Kruger, or just to read a physics book, buddy. So I went ahead and read those physics books, and then compared them to some alternatives. And after near 14 years of intense research, Occam's razor has led me to lean towards classic physics, plasma physics, Galilean transformations, 3D Euclidean geometry, the work of Dr. Edward Dowdy, Hannes Alfvén, Winston Bostick, Nikola Tesla, and many more Nobel laureates, PhD-holding professionals, and dissenting minds. I'm also well aware of Walter Russell's work and his interpretation that light doesn't travel. But I think that can be refined. That doesn't mean light doesn't propagate. It means the same light doesn't travel around. It is re-emitted, or as he said, reproduced from wave field to wave field, which is a more esoteric way of saying re-emitted from media to media. Or even someone like Ron Hatch, who wrote a book called Escape from Einstein, detailing how GPS does not need relativity whatsoever. But Ron's interpretation was slightly different than Dr. Edward Dowdy's position, yet the same points apply. Going over the details of how relativity isn't needed for GPS and an alternative to time dilation might take another equally long video, but I have a few links, equations, diagrams, and material you can scrutinize that I'll link in the video below, in the comment section or wherever this is posted. All of this is really just the tip of the iceberg so people can gain context and learn about the history of different models, that there are indeed credible alternatives and equations which yield the same solutions and predictions, and to learn about the existence of Dr. Edward Dowdy and his brilliant contributions to science and astrophysics. This video is for people who are interested in credible alternatives to relativity and mainstream models as to how light behaves and propagates, looking at the same data and interpreting it in different ways, yielding some of the same conclusions, but with a different approach. I tend to have a lot more visual material than audio in my videos, so you can replay it, pause it, or put it on mute, and those who don't speak English can still glean information and learn without words. Thank you for watching.